Hi, students. This lecture looks at kind of a larger frame of the course, which is yoga in the transcultural context. So when we talk about transcultural context, we're talking about a practice which is adopted internationally and transformed by the interpretation of the mores, of the concerns, ethics, values of different cultures, enthusiasms of different cultures. So with yoga, sometimes there's some difficulty in, I would say, accepting that process, because we look at it as either on the one hand a religious evolute, which means it somehow should be impervious to transformation, or we look at it as a cultural evolute which belongs to a people who are quote-unquote oppressed. What I want to point to is that this process is not in the least bit unusual. We transform everything all the time. Even my words, as they're coming into your brain right now, are, to refer back to a previous lecture, shaped by your particular filter. And one of those filters is cultural. You can't help but read the meaning of my particular words in the larger theme of my discussion in terms of your own values and concerns. Certain things you'll see, certain things you won't see, certain things you'll understand, certain things you won't understand, certain things you will interpret in one way where another person will interpret another, just like we do with everything that we encounter all day long. So this is a process which is going on continually with all of our cultural evolutes, and we're talking about even the most mundane things like shirts and pants. I mean, I'm not a historian of shirts and pants, but I think they were made in Europe. The automobile was developed in the West. The airplane was developed in the West. But now these things are developed in other cultures. And we don't blink an eye when something technological is transformed or adopted by another culture. Many cultures seek to export their cultural productions, such as in the case of Christianity. We have a black Christ in the Christian cultures of Africa. We have a white Christ in the cultures of America and Europe, and he wasn't white and he wasn't black, he was Semitic. So every culture sees its own, with its own eyes, sees other cultural productions. But this is not negative. This is positive. In fact, it's the only thing we can do. And it is creative. That's what we need to understand, that this process is creative. And it is what humans do to make the old new. It's how a tradition is updated. It's how a tradition becomes live. And so yoga is a very fascinating example of this, because it originates in the Indian subcontinent. We have hints of it in the Vedas. That's a whole larger discussion. It moves to the Upanishads, it moves to the Tantric era, it moves into the Hatha Yoga era, and then it becomes transcultural when it's discovered it's discovered by travelers in the Middle Ages and even Chinese before that. There's always kind of a dialogue with yogis. Even Alexander the Great in the 4th century had dialogues with yogis. But it starts to become truly transcultural after 1893 when Vivekananda spreads it to America. And what we need to understand is that Vivekananda intended to spread it to America. And subsequent yogis who came after him, a chief one of whom was Paramahansa Yogananda, who we'll look at, attempted to evangelize yoga. They even used that word. Yogananda used that word. Evangelize yoga into the Western context. At one point, Vivekananda wrote to some of his disciples. He was pulling a bunch of his followers out to an island on the St. Lawrence River to have the first yoga retreat. And he said, I'm going to see if I can manufacture a few yogis. So the intent was there from the East to the West to bring yoga into our context. And they didn't know what we were going to do with it. They began to perceive it as they came into our environment. Yogananda, as we read Anya P. Foxton's book on Yogananda, we'll understand how he adapted his practice to the American audience, how he left some things out from certain practices and included other things. And Vivekananda did very much the same. And he was very frank about this in his letters back to his fellow yogis back in India. He talked about what Americans could understand and accept and what they could not. So we do that unconsciously, of course. We have our own frame, and in some sense, I love this phrase, we are all experts until we know different. Yeah, we come to a thing with a basic presumption that we're comfortable knowing it, unless those few of us who have well-developed humility, and I know that I'm not always one of those people. In looking at this biography of these three figures, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, who is completely immersed, he's completely what we call etic. He's completely in his cultural context, sunk in it completely. He's actually an agent of it as a king. And then we have someone like Paramahansa Yogananda, who in the transcultural production of yoga is a figure who accelerated that transcultural adaptation by this engine of culture that is the United States, such a powerful engine on the world stage. He is that transition figure, one of the key ones like Vivekananda from 1893 to 1896, and then from 1899 to 1900. That's when Vivekananda came. Paramahansa Yogananda came in 1920, went back briefly to India in 1936, and then came back to the country there through into 1937, came back to the country and died in 1952. So he spent a huge chunk of his life in this country spreading yoga and translating it for another cultural audience. So we have Arjuna immersed in the Indian context, a yogi only as defined by Indian standards. We have Paramahansa Yogananda, a transition figure in the modern age who is an agent of the reinterpretation of the practice for both modernity, for the current age, and for Western audiences. And then we have Anna Forrest, who is a primary agent of actually her own cultural synthesis, her own bricolage, and we'll look carefully at that word later, her own combination of ideas and effects and methods that partly partake of a deeply indigenous practice here, the indigenous practices of American Indians, but also partakes of the Ashtanga Yoga of K. Pattabhi Jois, one of the chief progenitors of yoga in the modern period, who died in 2009, and the work of B.K.S. Iyengar. She studied with B.K.S. Iyengar briefly, who was the kind of probably the greatest champion of yoga for all time, born in 1918 and died in 2014. So she was an agent of physical culture as well. She was a great, very strong athlete, and her practice is extremely athletic. And then she draws from the strains of Indian yoga, and she draws from Native American practices. And of course, she just is simply an American. So she must interpret it through her own eyes. So she's an agent deeply centered in the modern Western and particularly American interpretation of the practice actually at an exponential level, because she's drawing back on Native American themes as well. So I just want to point to this reality of our three primary biographies in the course, how they orient us in three different cultural experiences of this profound practice of yoga. Thanks for listening.